I'm Deacon Scott, and this is my Catholic Witness. So I'm a permanent deacon in the Catholic Church. I've been so for 9 years, ordained 9 years, and prior to that, I've been married as my first vocation for 27 years. So in who I am, I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm employed by the federal government. A permanent deacon receives holy orders just like a priest, in the sense that we receive holy orders, but it's configured. The church's term is it's configured for a different purpose. A priest is configured to primarily consecrate host to the sacraments of healing, confession, anointing of the sick. A deacon is called to be the bearer of the gospel, to read the gospel at Mass, and then also in their life that they live in community as oftentimes employed elsewhere than the church to represent sacramentally the presence of the church, the serving church. I was born in 1966 at the close of the Second Vatican Council, right during that time frame. So my experience as a Catholic child was this, I would say, kind of a challenge for my mom particularly, who was a cradle Catholic herself, to transition from the Baltimore Catholic upbringing that she had and the Vatican II experience that she was now living into. So I was a test child of that, as those that were born in 1966 were very much as well. So my childhood, though, as a Catholic was very rich in the tradition of that mix of those two worlds now coming to full light in Vatican II. I was never an altar boy. My brother was, though, who was 5 years older than I was. And so I would watch him and take part in the Mass in the pew. And my dad's job moved us around the country. So I had varied experiences of the Catholic faith in different parts of the United States, from the West Coast to the Great Lakes area by Ohio, all the way down to Georgia in the southeast. So it was a childhood experience, not only of a transition from pre-Vatican II to Vatican II, but also a transition across the country of different experiences. My mother, who is Native American, was born and raised on the reservation as a Catholic because her mother was Catholic. Her father was not Catholic. He was actually the spiritual leader for our tribe all of his life. And so I grew up in this experience on and off of knowing I was Catholic, but also knowing that I was Potawatomi, which was our tribe. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was challenged with that. I struggled with where are you, if God is calling me somewhere, where is He calling me? Because I don't want to disrespect my traditional aspects as a tribal member, nor of all that my grandfather had taught me. But I don't want to give up on my Catholic faith either. And so by the time I was in my later teens, I was really challenged with this to make a decision. I felt like I needed to choose one way or the other. And it was my grandfather who ironically represented the greatest faith moment in my life when he passed. About 6 months before, as he was declining in health, he reconciled in his mind that he saw no challenge between the faith that he had grown up in and his becoming Catholic. So he became Catholic 6 months before he died, and that choice that he made helped me to embrace what was otherwise a dual experience in my life. He did throughout his life, as a consequence of his responsibility to be our traditional leader for our tribe, he witnessed to me service. And his willingness to serve, no matter what the conditions were, whether it was to bury someone, whether it was to take care of a newborn in terms of naming that child and helping to gather together the community for a person who was suffering sickness. I mean, all these things he represented to me were so, now I would couch them as very diaconal, were witnessing to me service that God wanted me to embrace. Where I experienced God in my ordination was powerful in that I realized how much giving others had put to that, to my receiving this gift of ordination. The grace of ordination is not mine. It's the community that helped me to receive that ordination, and then the community that I'm going to ultimately serve. And I was thinking of that as I was laying on the altar, prostrate before the altar, and crying and watching my tears fall to the floor as I laid there looking down and thinking that how is it possible that I could be here as a whole person? And by that I mean that there's so many things that take a person's time, and here I was a husband, a father of 4 with a job, and I'm taking on a responsibility that I had no idea. And I still have no full idea of what it will ask of me. But that's okay, because God is the one making the time and opening up the pathways for me to follow if I just trust that. And I had to trust that at the moment I was laying on the altar to receive that ordination. So my vocation is marriage. And though I am ordained as a deacon, my vocation will always be marriage. And it's the marriage that brings me to the, as Mother Teresa would say, the call within a call.
So you said when you were young you were discerning whether to go into the priesthood. So how did you come to deciding to get married?
I remember talking to my religious director of the youth ministry there, and letting him know that I was struggling with this because I'd been dating a woman that I really cared for, and now I was in the midst of, again, another dual experience of I want to serve God, and yet I'm falling in love. And I think that the realization that my love for my wife would bring me to a place of wholeness was clearer to me than entering into the seminary. So I have no regrets of not becoming a priest, and I didn't go into the diaconate to make up for that challenge. The diaconate came out of an experience of my vocation as a husband and a father.
So how did you go from being a Catholic layman in the pews to being a deacon?
The formation was about 4 years in the making, and it was a year of discernment for my wife and I, and that was intentional, that each of the couples would go through this discernment together. And then 3 years after being chosen to enter into the training, 3 years of training. And in the midst of the training and the formation, you're well formed to understand this is very different than anything that you've worked towards before. It's not to get a degree. It's not to receive the diploma. It's not to get a position or title. It's to truly trust that what you're doing is not in your control. You're setting your will to God by way of the diocese, just giving yourself to the process and trusting that God will lead you through that. And we would always say, as a group, God willing, I'll become a deacon. We were married for just about 5 years, and we wanted to have children, and my wife became pregnant. We went through that pregnancy with a great hope and excitement, and had no notion of anything that could go wrong in that. And in my wife's last week of her coming to full term, we lost the baby due to an umbilical cord accident. And the challenge to our faith was incredible as we were struggling with why of that. It was our first child. Our marriage was in a growing state, and we were away from family when that took place. And so as a consequence, we were left to the community that we were in. And the challenge to our faith was tremendous for both of us. And it worked right at the core of our marriage to either, we realized in reflection, to destroy it completely, or give our marriage a resolve that would bring us forward into a new reality, because the reality that we had anticipated had been shattered. We, from that point forward, depended on the tradition that if you will, that our family had given us, the habit of going to church, which became such an anchor for us at a time when we didn't really want to go to church. We really didn't have a faith that was strong as a consequence of that loss of the child. But our community that we lived in Arcata, California, this little town, came around us and gave us support. And for 2 years, in the midst of our numbness of this experience, continually fed us, even at times when we didn't want to be fed. And by their constant presence in our lives, brought us through that to where we felt like we could rebuild. And sure enough, 2 years later, we began that rebuilding, and we had a child. And going through that process and reflection, it was certainly the hardest and most painful thing that either of us had ever experienced, and I would say will ever experience. But in recognizing that it was the community that gave us the anchor we needed, speaks to the church as its greatest gift for people who face tremendous challenges, that we can't be saved by ourselves. If it was left up to us to save ourselves, we would fail utterly. I had never gone to adoration until I started on the pathway to becoming a deacon. And I say that, I hadn't gone to adoration in earnest. I had experienced it a few times, and at that point, my 36 years of living, but not to the extent that I entered into it afterwards. And it became my favorite tradition because it's people really are perplexed by that if they're not Catholic, and there are Catholics who are perplexed by it as well, because it's such a challenge initially to kneel before the Blessed Sacrament, and you're either waiting or you're preoccupying your mind with some action. And it was going through that for me that I came to a constant presence that I needed during my formation as a deacon. And for us as Catholics, that represents where we want to be, where we understand we'll be when we die, is that we'll be before God praying and thanking. It gets you out of yourself. And when you go to communion and you receive Christ, so oftentimes we're so consumed by ourselves, even as we receive Christ, that we aren't even at times appreciative when we sit back down after receiving Christ, to say thank you, or to take a moment and realize, I've received the body of Christ. You can't help but dwell on that when you're before the Blessed Sacrament in adoration. And that's the beauty, I think, that we have as a tradition of our faith. As a Catholic deacon, I think that the greatest challenge for me is to represent to people what we're all called to do. That even though I have received the ordination to be a permanent deacon, everyone I talk to, everyone I assist in a sacrament, if I'm at a wedding or if I baptize a child, it's bringing that community that's gathered there to an awareness that we're all called to serve. We're all called to be diaconal. And it's represented by the priest in the washing of the feet, of which we're all called to do, not just the priest. But I can best remind people of that by not being clerical in my actions as deacon, but to be human. And I do that in my homilies. I present experiences of my work life, of my family life in the midst of the homily. And I think that's unique for a deacon to be responsible to present to a community in an authentic way that brings them to an awareness that they have as much a responsibility as I do to serve others as faithful